Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Rowan. I will be presenting on a project called Life as the Beast Cyborg, following the Postmodern and Posthuman tracks in Djuna Barnes's Nightwood, which was an honors departmental thesis for English advised by Professor John Matthews. So I want to start by just, I think, asking a question that maybe a lot of people don't know the answer to. I don't know if people assume that English majors maybe are just studying semicolon usage all day. But I think maybe another common misconception is that what literary studies is about is sort of telling you one way to read a text and one way to understand literature and understand what something really means. But it's not quite that either. So more of what we do, we sometimes don't solve food insecurity, as some of my other peers are doing today, but we do, look at questions of how texts might reveal what sorts of ways people are thinking about the world and how that might then inform some political and social decisions. So we think about matters of the text itself and also the context of composition and how it's been received in various time periods, and what might be revealed by these things. We put it in combination with other texts and see what comes out and what seems to be revealed. And we try to offer non-authoritative readings and just examine what seems to be coming out of the text, what seems to be alive in it, and what that might be able to tell us about our current situation. So, to just start with a brief bit of background on Djuna Barnes and Nightwood. Nightwood is a 1936 novel. I first encountered it in a freshman year intro to fiction class. I would tell you about the plot, but if you know anything about modernist novels from this period, it's hard to describe it having a plot. But it's sort of about people of many different backgrounds who are drifting through interwar Europe, specifically Paris, and there are just radical changes going on in this society at the time, and there is the sense that things could either go in a very positive direction or a very negative direction. And of course, we know our history and we know what happened, but there's this very bizarre, tense moment where it seems like no one is quite sure what is going to happen next. And in the midst of all of this, we have Felix, Nora, and Jenny, three characters who all try to tame a character named Robin Vote, that is the word that Djuna Barnes uses, who is described as wild, and they all fail, and they all have their hearts broken by her. So, what really struck me about reading this book as a freshman was that my professor did not even try to tell us what it was about, but he still assigned it to us, and that's less alien to me now, but obviously at the time, I would have been expecting my professor to have a solid answer about why we were reading this and what it meant, and he did not. So I started to wonder if maybe that was part of the appeal of this piece of literature. And I always wanted to return to it later in my studies, and I sort of looked into it over the years and found that a lot of scholars actually emphasize the difficulty of understanding it as one of the essential aspects of it. So what the project ended up being is a standard CAS departmental honors thesis in English. These run 40 to 50 pages. I just performed, pretty traditional literary studies, offering a way to interpret Nightwood that I think is less bleak and more radical than I think a lot of the other interpretations tend to be, relying on textual analysis of the novel and some other short stories by Barnes. And I wanted to, again, push existing readings further because I think they have a tendency to accept a lot of things at face value that I'm not entirely sure need to be unchallenged. I placed it in conversation with a lot of post-structural philosophy and theory. So if you know any of these figures, Foucault, Judith Butler, Derrida, Donna Haraway, Deleuze and Guattari, and some similar figures, I'm not going to go into that because we don't have time, but if you know any of them, those are some pretty heavy hitters in the field. So my hope was to create a text that is itself sort of creative and aesthetic and sort of politically and philosophically fulfilling. So just to give you a very brief crash course of some of the main things that came out of this project, the novel features many characters who are marginalized in various different ways. There are a lot of expats in Europe. There are queer characters in terms of sexuality and gender. There are Jewish characters. And a lot of people note that these characters are portrayed with sympathy for the time, which is a very big asterisk, obviously, and it's an ongoing discussion to what extent Barnes is sort of poisoned by the discourse that she comes out of. but she is trying to display, I think, in a lot of ways how these characters are prone to echoing the stereotypes about them. And there's a lot of focus on how the stereotyping of these characters sort of causes them to behave in the ways that they do, by sort of circumscribing what is possible for them in life. So, for instance, Robin, who obviously is in relationships with two women throughout the text, is portrayed as a wild animal in a lot of ways and described as such by other characters and even the narrator. And obviously, I think in 2025, this is a big red flag for us in terms of how queer people are spoken about, especially in the 30s at this time. But Barnes is on record as saying she wishes people were more like beasts, and so I wanted to look into what exactly that means. And of course, Barnes herself was in a very serious relationship with a woman for a long time on whom Robin is actually based, although she rejected the label of lesbian for herself. So what's interesting about this is, again, that it sort of shows how stereotypes maybe come to be sort of produced through marginalization that claims that they are already true and uses that as a justification for bigotry, essentially. And so because these characters are stuck in these positions, I wanted to ask what empowerment, if any, can be found from within the positions they are marginalized in. So one of the ideas that came out was this idea of gray areas that are overwritten in dominant discourse. So one of the concepts that is helpful in understanding this text is the way in which marginalization can, in a surprising way, create some opportunities for limited autonomy. Because if you are excluded from human society and ejected from human society, that's traumatic and terrible and in many cases dangerous. But it also means that in some cases, human society maybe stops trying to police you or stops trying to care about the outcome for you. So one thing that came out of this reading was the way in which normative ideals are not, they don't come down from the mountain already existing. They're actually sort of produced through the marginalization that is actually deciding what is normal and what is abnormal in the act of excluding certain people. And so as we all, I think, have realized, hopefully, ideal terms always fail to describe reality and especially people. So no one is entirely one thing or another. We're all sort of blends of various different things that are recognized in various different ways. And so one of the things that came out of this project was the way in which Barnes is portraying characters who don't want to be put into a single box, as she herself did not in life, and what options there may be for those characters. I also worked with Judith Butler, who is, of course, quite famous. Their work on gender is, through the lens of Foucault, is working with the idea that what might be an effective way to resist solidified norms of who counts as human and who does not is to sort of make visible the incongruities and all the little things that don't quite fit with everyone's standard normative definitions of who is normative, of who is normal and who is not. So, for instance, Robin is animalized by society, but a lot of the characters remark on the way that this reveals that we are all sort of animals already, but society has decided there's a certain proper way to be human. And I focus on specifically Barnes's use of the word beast rather than animal, and the fact that beast implies a value judgment in a way that someone has failed to behave as they are properly supposed to. So an animal is, of course, just an animal, but a beast is like a human who acts like an animal, or an animal that doesn't act the way that we want it to. So I want to focus on how sort of articulating some kind of beast subjectivity might make visible all the contradictions that are erased by this basic human-animal, civilized, savage binary that obviously has perpetuated a lot of cruelty throughout history. And Robin is even described as a beast turning human. So I wanted to kind of turn the equation in the other direction and see what it might be like for humanity to try to turn beastly. So you might be wondering why the cyborg thing. That seems very at odds with the rest of this, and that is a completely natural reaction. But the thing is that focusing on a return to the natural or return to the animal before civilization or before discourse kind of risks creating new dichotomies to replace the old of who is natural and who is maybe artificial. And this can be just another way to eject people or exclude people. And so one of the things that's emphasized by cyborg feminist theory is that we should all recognize that we are actually always already blended and impure. We already come from a mix of cultures and different sources and origins. And so we want to stop defining ourselves based on saying, I am this because I am not that, and I reject and repudiate all of that, and maybe even persecute that. So these texts also emphasize how we can maybe build a self, and how philosophy and thinking can be a project in actually creating a worldview rather than receiving one from cultural structures that already exist, and emphasizing that we want to build a cyborg beast rather than discover one that already exists, because again, this can risk sort of the same kinds of essentialist dichotomies. And this just overall, I think, undermines any claim to essential truth or an origin-based narrative of a unity before something else has disrupted it. So I wanted to focus on a project that would articulate visions of a liberated selfhood that could be shared as a political and philosophical project, and might resolve Barnes's sort of ambivalence, in which she seems to believe that animality, while beautiful, must be suppressed, sometimes violently, by civilization. And I wanted to ask, why is that? Is that really necessary? So thank you very much for listening.
We have time for one question. Any questions? Yeah.
Eric, congrats on this project. This is fantastic. Just a question about the historical period. Being a historian, I'm wary, like you seem to be, of projecting backwards onto 1936, the sort of end of the story that we know.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you sort of grapple with that, especially since, as you said, well, I don't remember if you said it sort of emerged to you to think about what might be empowering, or whether you sort of went looking for it. So I don't want to say you were trying to be optimistic or something, but yeah, how did you sort of avoid jumping the gun on what we know happens historically?
I think, if I'm understanding correctly, yeah, the question of optimism, or undue optimism, perhaps, is definitely a very important one, and especially because it seems like Barnes is certainly affected by the stereotypes and prejudices that she has learned. But I think that what comes out is that she is very skeptical of attempts to exclude people or to define who somebody is without allowing them to have a say in that matter. And so while I think there is a sense in which she does kind of ignore that these things are, that there's maybe a real danger at play, I think her suggestion is not so much ignoring the danger, but just that for her, maybe the solution is not to rush to try to prove that certain people are normal, but rather to question, why we should all have to follow certain norms in the first place.
Awesome. All right, that's all the time we have. Next up will be Ella.